www. Dot.
New Haven Independent.
No, yay.
Half hour. Hello and welcome to WNHH Radio's Dateline New Haven. I'm your host, Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make our city tick. A specter is haunting New Haven and the United States, folks, and it has a familiar name. Thy name is socialism. People don't always mean the same thing when they talk about socialism, but majorities of young people in particular are embracing the term. The leading candidate for the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination is a proud, self-described democratic socialist, and his opponents are racing to embrace his positions. Here in New Haven, a chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America is up and running, and a separate party for socialism and liberation has been visible on the streets, demonstrating on behalf of immigrant rights and of the government in Venezuela. So what is this all about? The man in the WNHA studio today can help us figure out that answer. He wrote the book on socialism, on today's socialism and tomorrow's. His name is John Romer. He is a political science professor and economist at Yale. His most recent book is called A Future for Socialism. Welcome to WNHH, and thanks so much for coming in.
Hi, Paul. Thanks.
And please, you're doing a good job. Get close to that mic.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to start off by just asking you, what do people mean today? Do they mean something consistently when they say in polls that they support socialism?
Well, the Democratic Socialists of America, the most public representative of whom is now Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who got elected as a congresswoman from New York, means, she's subscribing to a particular version of socialism that's been very successful in the world, which is called social democracy. And the main exemplars of this system are the Scandinavian countries, the Nordic countries. There are 5 of them, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Iceland. And to some extent, the same policies are followed in the Northern European countries when you go south to Germany and even to France. And generally in Europe, the welfare state is much larger than it is in the United States. But the characteristic of social democracy is that it does not make any real attempt to own firms.
Mm-hmm.
So firms remain privately owned, but there's a really very significant redistribution of income from both earnings and from profit income, capital income, to fund a very, very generous welfare state, so that in these countries, the tax bite of the state is about more or less 50% of total national income, whereas in the United States, the federal government gets about 30% of
And when we talk about that,
income.
we're also talking about how that's distributed, right?
So
in our country, wealthy people pay a lot less tax than they do in other countries. So it's not that everybody pays 50% there or everyone pays 30% here. But over there, the wealthier people pay a lot more than 50%, correct?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. But it's not only income tax. I mean, a large part of the taxes are collected through value-added taxes, which is like a sales tax. You pay it when you buy retail goods.
So why are we at this moment, Professor? Why are so many people all of a sudden using the word socialist and not getting their butts beat?
Because I think there's been a massive disillusionment in this country with what's happened to the distribution of income in the last 40 or 50 years. I can talk about the details of that.
Yeah, in other words, rich got richer.
Not only did the rich get richer, massively richer, but the bottom half of the population gained virtually nothing in real income since 1980. Virtually nothing. I'll give you figures in a minute if you ask me. But
sure.
The consequence of that is the bottom 50% have been completely disillusioned. And They see on television and they see around them how the wealthy, the top 10%, let's say, even more the top 1%, have done very, very well in the last 50 years. But they are treading water, and their children are probably earning less in many cases than they did. So that disillusionment resulted in both a move to the left, people supporting Bernie Sanders, who was pointing this out, and a move to the right towards Trump, who was proposing various flim-flam solutions to the problem. I mean, he was the only candidate among the Republicans who seemed to have some consciousness of the difficult lives of working-class people.
Yeah, people kind of forget that he had talked about ending corporate loopholes, which he ended up doing.
Well, he did a lot more than that. He talked about having a massive infrastructure investment, and which would have been very good for people, but of course he hasn't done that.
So the political scientist Norman Ornstein has been saying for years that whenever people on the left look at very real statistics showing that there's overwhelming public support for policies that you can call social democratic, socialist, then in reality says the reason it doesn't succeed in modern America is that unlike in other nations, there is a belief in right or wrong, you and I might argue wrong, in the ease of mobility to anyone who earns a meritocracy. So people on the bottom want to identify with people at the top because there's this faith that you can get there. As opposed to, let's say, in England, even if there's just the same amount of mobility, there's this long-held idea about class structure where people identify with a certain class and aren't trying to identify with a different social class. Do you agree with that analysis? I mean, why don't we have a socialist country? If there was a great story in the New York Times the other day analyzing the polling data that shows overwhelmingly people don't care about having private insurance. Overwhelmingly, they want a single payer. Overwhelmingly, they want minimum wage hikes. Overwhelmingly, they want higher taxes on the rich. And we keep electing people who don't want that.
I think it has to do largely with the history, the political history of this country. In the European countries, there were massive labor and socialist and communist parties that grew over the 20th century, culminating in the elections in 1944 and 1945 in every democracy in Europe, in which about half of the vote went to these left-wing parties. And those parties were built by trade unions, and they were, I mean, there's a very interesting history why they emerged in Europe and not the United States. The U.S. has never had a successful socialist left-wing labor or a left-wing labor party like that that's had any mass presence in the legislature.
And it's interesting how even union members, blue-collar union members, went with Ronald Reagan when he shifted the country.
Well,
right
some of them
did.
Some of them did, but that's, I think, also because of the lack of a working-class consciousness in this country. I mean, there was the belief.
That's sort of what I think Ornstein was getting to. Why is there a lack of working-class consciousness?
Well, I think largely it's political because workers have not been educated by socialist parties or labor parties or their trade unions to be anti-capitalist and to see the inequity of the capitalist system. So what's happened is now they're open to suggestion from very right-wing demagogues. Not all of them. A lot of people a lot of working-class people were supporting Sanders. But I think the essential background of the lack of a massive socialist movement in the United States has to do with history. I also think the fact
what's the root of that history?
I also think that the fact that the European countries were invaded by Hitler and they had to develop tremendous solidarity to fight Hitler and fascism really moved those countries to the left. It made them more solidaristic and more cooperative. The United States, of course, participated in the war. We were very important in the war, but we were never invaded except for the bombing of Pearl Harbor. We lost 400,000 people in the war, 400,000 troops. Russia, for instance, lost, the estimate is now a minimum of 20 million people.
Yeah. Okay, and we're talking to John Romer, who is a Yale economist and political scientist. He wrote the book on socialism called The Future for Socialism. Talk about this. Are we in a socialist moment now? We talked historically how the working class might be more susceptible to right-wing demagoguery, unlike in other countries more so. Are we seeing something different now, given that Ocasio-Cortez got elected, given that Bernie Sanders is the leading candidate, calling himself proudly a democratic socialist, given that his agenda is embraced by candidates who don't use the word? Are we seeing socialist resurgence in America, and what does it mean?
I think we are. Whether it's going to succeed in actually taking power in the Democratic Party by the election of a candidate that calls him or herself socialist, I'm not sure. But I want to make another point that what's being advocated by these people, and I support them completely, is not the radical kind of socialism that we associate with Marxism, but social democracy. It maintains private ownership of firms. It doesn't challenge that. Whereas the main economic idea of socialism was that the capital income, that is to say, profits, rents, and interest, which are earned from property and from wealth, should be socialized, should be nationalized, and distributed more or less equally to the whole population. That would be a very fundamental change in the way our economy works. And these particular candidates are not advocating that. I think there is a role for nationalization of wealth, socialization of wealth, and equalization of the distribution of capital income in the country.
Does that mean that you would have all private enterprise taken over, or enterprises that serve the public good? Like, instead of having a private monopoly, government-supported electric company, instead of having private insurance companies that give you health care, instead of having private owners get Section 8 vouchers to run on income housing, is it more like basic needs you think should be covered by the government while you'd retain a private market otherwise?
No, I don't think the distinction is necessarily between basic needs and other goods. I think the distinction is between small business and big business. So I'm perfectly happy I would encourage entrepreneurship and small business. I think there's a tremendous source of innovation in small business, and that should be preserved. But when firms become huge, when they become, firms that have hundreds of billions of dollars of sales a year, which is the case with our large firms today, then they should be owned by the people. They shouldn't be owned by private investors.
Do you think that's what people support who say in polls now they support socialist candidates? Do you think that's what Bernie's up to?
I don't think so. No, he's not talking about that. He's talking about a much more pervasive welfare state, universal health care, regulation of monopolies and antitrust, sharply progressive taxation, paid vacations and parental leave for workers, strong protection of unions, strong social insurance, which all these things. And I think those are all wonderful reforms, which most of the advanced capitalist countries in the world have. Europe is a very different place from the United States in terms of the security net that people have, which is provided by state financing.
Okay, so you're making a distinction here between, and I want to get to this in this show, your view of how socialism could work and really be socialism, but not Marxian socialism. And what Bernie Sanders is talking about, and what most people are responding in polls. And I've really been thinking about that a lot, Professor Romer, because when Bernie thought it was important to call himself a socialist, and I talk to young people who are for socialism, and I'm hearing Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I'm hearing Teddy Roosevelt regulate the trust busting. I'm hearing Franklin Roosevelt expanded welfare state, Social Security, union rights, regulation of corporate misdeeds, and they were the saviors of capitalism.
That's right, but I don't think that's I think what young people mean when 50% of them say they prefer socialism to capitalism is they're talking about a very comprehensive welfare state. And that's a very important step, and I am completely behind it. I think our country would be massively better for people if we had those kinds of protections and that kind of safety net. And all the evidence is having such a safety net does not hurt productivity. I mean, if you look,
it helps it, right? You can work because you're not sick.
If you look at the standard of living in Denmark, you walk down the street in Copenhagen or in Sweden or even Germany, it's massively better for the ordinary person than it is in this country. There isn't this very large fraction of poor people, very poor people, especially children. There's very little poverty among children, whereas in the United States we have quite high poverty. So these reforms, I think, can be done through taxation, but they're not what I think is the final institutional design we should be aiming for. We should be aiming for the nationalization of firms which control huge amounts of wealth.
Okay. So when people support these positions, the first group you're talking about, whether it's Bernie Sanders or Ocasio-Cortez, the strategy now by the Republican Party going into 2020 is to say that word socialist as much as they can. Because, and especially, we'll get to the the Green New Deal, because I know you've written a lot about climate change.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about climate change policies, when you talk about, except perhaps when you're talking about some of the market solutions, when you're talking about single payer, when you're talking about public financing, taxing the wealthy, those positions have overwhelming support. What the Republican Party is banking on is that if you call it socialism, if you take the politicians, the few who want to call it socialism, like Bernie, like Ocasio-Cortez, then you'll be able to distract people from talking about the merits of the proposals and get them to turn against it, because in the modern history of American politics since the Cold War, our generation of politics, no one who called herself or himself a socialist ever had a chance in a mainstream election. So they're banking that, a lot of people are banking, including some of the Democratic Party Club, which are supporters, that if you're branded socialist or like that, you can't win a general election in America. But I'm wondering if we're wrong about that because we're old. I'm wondering if what the polling data is telling us, what Bernie Sanders did so much better in the primaries in 2016 than I think most of us of our generation thought was possible. Is that because that word doesn't scare people anymore?
I think it doesn't. It scares people much less. You have to remember, in the early 1950s, after the war, and when the Cold War began, during the war, the United States, of course, was in alliance with the Soviet Union. After the war, they saw the Soviet Union as dangerous because it was providing an example of how material conditions could be pretty good for working class people, which was very much against the capitalist institutions that we had here. I mean, everything, all the firms were owned by the state in the Soviet Union. So that was a massive threat to U.S. capitalists. And so what happened in this country was, very conveniently, Eugene McCarthy was a very anti-communist senator who did a huge amount of attacking of communists and red baiting, and people got very scared.
Joe McCarthy. Gene McCarthy was the dove who ran for president.
I don't think I said Gene McCarthy.
I was thinking, I didn't know Gene McCarthy had.
Anyway,
Joe McCarthy,
Joseph
from Wisconsin.
McCarthy from Wisconsin. So he actually, the press played an important role finally in exposing him. Edward R. Murrow did a wonderful job of showing what a charlatan and what a McCarthy was. But anyway, there was a lot of red baiting. Unions were kicked out of the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Unions, that had communist members and communist leaders in them. There was a real attempt to frighten working class people about socialism as a way, or communism, as a way of building the resistance to the Soviet example. You have to remember that in 1953, the Soviet Union was not a failing economy. It was an extremely successful economy.
It did fail, though.
It eventually failed. And
some would argue because it wasn't true socialism.
No, I think it failed because, well, that's another discussion. But
yeah.
I think two major reasons. One was that it was not democratic, and democracy is, despite all its weaknesses, a way of correcting errors. And secondly, because it was too afraid of using markets. So I'm what's called a market socialist. I think we have to use markets to allocate resources. But I don't think that using markets commits us to having the kind of distribution of income that we have in the United States today, where about 40% of the wealth is owned by the top 10% of the population.
Eric Mastriano Sr. weighs in. Good morning to all. Thank you for listening, Eric. On Facebook, he writes, socialism never worked and it never will. So you started addressing that. You think that democratic socialism works, and you believe that's what we're seeing, that social democratic governments in Scandinavian countries and parts of Europe, a greater, which is very characterized by a free market, but a greater welfare state, you believe that that has worked, and that is socialism.
Has definitely worked, and it's a kind of socialism. As I said, I think the first experiments with socialism on a national scale were in the early 20th century. I mean, the main example being the Russian Revolution, and then the Chinese Revolution in 1949. But the problem with these experiments, they made many mistakes, and I think that we can learn from those, and the next attempt at nationalizing wealth, I think, will be much more successful. And people I think the most important economist in giving us the economic history of capitalism in the last couple centuries and the possibilities for the redistribution of wealth is Thomas Piketty, the Frenchman, who wrote the book called Capital in the 20th century.
Never knew that's how you pronounce his name.
Thomas
Piketty. About him. Yeah.
So it's a wonderful book.
Piketty, yeah.
And I encourage people to read it.
It had a huge impact worldwide on the discussion about inequality of wealth.
No.
So you and I are the type of people I think who like to believe socialism can work if it's democratic.
Mm-hmm.
China might be a cautionary tale because China decided under Deng in the 80s and 90s that it was going to open up markets but not be democratic.
Right.
So the idea always was that with an open market comes democracy. We believe we kind of saw that in South Korea, that once you have people free to experiment with different ideas on the small scale, to pursue ideas entrepreneurially, to question markets and therefore the government, that produces a better economy. China succeeded for quite a while with no democracy but a freer market. What do you take from that?
So China accomplished something fantastic. No question about it.
But they weren't democratic.
It pulled 500 million, 600 million people out of poverty in a period of 20 or 30 years. Just fantastic. I mean, the average real income of Chinese people from the period 1978 to 2005 or something rose by a factor of 1,300% in that period. And that includes a lot of the poor people of China, not all of them, but a great number of them. That's a huge accomplishment. And now what's happening is the income distribution is getting worse. There's growth of wealth at the top. The Chinese, it's not that the top 10% in China own 40% of the wealth. They own something like 20% of the wealth. So it's looking like a capitalist country in that sense. There's tremendous concentration of wealth. But it's a complicated system. It's not democratic at all, and I think that will eventually be its downfall. And also, I think it's lost the socialist ethos. I mean, the socialism depends for its sustainability on what I call a socialist ethos, which is an ethos of cooperation. That we are in this world to try to work with other people to help us all jointly improve our situations, our lives, and we have to cooperate to do that. The major form of cooperation in which we have succeeded, even in the capitalist countries in the last 50 years, has been the construction of large welfare states. So if about half of the income of the country is pooled and then redistributed, or used for public goods and redistributed as transfer payments to poor people or to unlucky people, that's a huge kind of cooperation. And I think socialism champions cooperation as opposed to the capitalist ethos, which is that we're in it for ourselves. Each of us should just compete with others. The only responsibility we have is to our families, and that's it. That's a very destructive ethos.
We have a responsibility to let you know you're listening to Dateline New Haven, WNHF FM, your home for community radio at 103.5, live streamed at newhaven.org. Today we have the pleasure of chatting with Professor John Romer, of political scientist and economist at Yale. He wrote the book on our moment right now. It's called A Future for Socialism. He's arguing that we do have a resurgence of interest and openness to an expanded welfare state form of social democracy, which he considers a good first step to what he thinks is the better long-term step of a democratic socialism that restrains the inequality of wealth and that nationalize large firms that get too big. Would you just nationalize Facebook? Would you nationalize Apple? Would you nationalize IBM? We just at some point decide the government takes it over, a worker council?
I would look for a plan in which we encourage small businesses. That's going to be the same for 90% of businessmen as it is now in the United States, freedom to form small businesses. But when a business gets to be large, I don't know what the size should be, sales of a couple billion a year or something, then it should be purchased by the state with public funds. Perhaps the guy who created it or the woman who created it, the Steve Jobs or the what's his name, the Facebook guy. Anyway, perhaps they will be hired as the CEO of the public firm, right? They know a lot about how to run that.
Does it
firm.
Open to corruption when you have like state-owned firms?
Sure, of course it is.
So how do you guard against that?
Of course it is.
Because some people would argue that you should have workers take it over. There are some proposals to have percentages of seats on boards of directors.
I think that's part of it. I think the boards of directors of these firms, I mean, even under capitalism, the boards of directors of these firms should include workers and other people concerned with the things like the environment. And in Germany, they do that. They have the firms of German capitalist corporations have seats occupied by workers and other representatives of the nation on their boards. And some say the consequence of that, Piketty says this actually, The consequence of that is that the value of German capitalist firms on the stock market is lower than the value of American firms. Why? Because they don't simply maximize profits. They
Right.
pay more attention to maximizing these other values that people have,
And I would
which
argue
are
that
often called externalities in economics, like the effect of the firm on the environment. Well, if you do that, you might be technologically as good as the normal capitalist firm, but you earn fewer profits, so your dividends will be lower, and the value, the capital stock, will have a perhaps lower value because there's not the same expectation of returns, and so they have lower value on the stock market. But that doesn't mean they're less efficient. So that's the confusion.
Green New Deal.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a good form of democratic socialism? Are you in favor of it?
Again, I think it's a package that we should all adopt. I think it's absolutely critical for our species, and not only our species, but lots of others, that we face honestly this climate change challenge and that we deal with it. So the Green New Deal is an attempt to change. I mean, the proposal of the Green New Deal by Markey and Ocasio-Cortez is meant to put back into the public discussion the fact that we really have to move radically and quickly to meet the climate
And that's
challenge.
really the most important part. I mean, they're setting a high goal: 10 years, get rid of fossil fuels.
Well, I don't think 10 years is going to. That's realistic.
No, but they're setting a goal.
I think it's a wonderful approach, and I have, there's certain things that they've not signed on to, which I think is a mistake, but they may sign on to them. So
does that include?
I do think
because your fellow economist William Nordhaus just won a
Nobel
Prize for arguing what he says is now the consensus among economists, like Rick Levin, the former president, that trading carbon tax credits, pollution, the ability right to pollute through market means, is how you adjust pollution. The Green New Deal does not agree with that. They believe you need direct government action to limit pollution rather than create incentives through the marketplace. Who's right?
I agree with Nordhaus. I think we can use.
So
the
you're
market.
not with the socialists on this. When does socialist position be?
They're
government
they're not the only socialists.
Well, Nordhaus is no socialist. He worked
No,
for
but
Gerald Ford.
but I am, and I think the market can be used to solve the problem. I've
And
written
tell me
about
about
this
that
myself.
So
So
why are they wrong? Why are the Democratic Socialists wrong that government needs to take firm action setting limits on how much you can pollute rather than leaving to the market? Because they believe the market can't solve it because the market would have solved the problem.
I have not talked to Ocasio-Cortez about this, and I don't know what the reasoning is why they're not signing on to some market solutions. I think there has to be a lot of international cooperation, and that's exhibited by meetings like the Paris meeting in 2016 or 2015, and there are these meetings annually. I think there has to be massive international cooperation. That goes against the usual practice of capitalists. But I do think markets are an institution that can be used to help solve the problem.
Now, what do you base that on? Is that based on your economic study where you've seen incentive work?
Yes, it's based on work I've done, in fact.
Tell me about that.
Well,
like what have you studied to show the market
I have
working?
a book. I have a recent paper, actually, that's not yet published.
It's on your website, though, right?
No, not yet.
Okay.
Not yet. In which this is written with a collaborator, and we advocate a system in which firms will pay for when they emit carbon. There'll be a price that they have to pay. It'll be like an input. They have to pay a price to use that input, which means to emit carbon when they manufacture things. And the payments for using carbon, the carbon fees, will go into an international fund. And the fund will be divided up among the countries of the world every year or every 2 years, something like that. So countries will contribute into the fund when they pollute, and that will be decentralized at the firm level. Firms will decide how much they pollute, and on the other hand, there'll be a internationally decided upon total level of pollution that is permitted or supplied, and that will be unanimously agreed upon by the countries of the world. The trick is that by setting the shares of the fund that they get back, that the various countries get back, you can arrange the distribution so that people will unanimously agree on what the global carbon budget should be. And we show that this can be done in a way which solves the climate problem.
So I think the conventional wisdom, correct me if I'm wrong, is twofold. One, conventional wisdom is that mainstream economists are right that market solutions can address the problem. And two, it's a politically tough sell. That if you
Sure.
look at the yellow vests in France, part of what they were reacting against is the impact of market-based restrictions on pollution that will then cost jobs.
And that may be indeed why Ocasio-Cortez is not supporting carbon taxes or carbon permits. But the error that Macron made in France, see, I don't think it's that they're worried about costing jobs. The error is that he was going to jack up the prices of gasoline to have an increased carbon tax, which I support, but he didn't say I'm going to return the money to people. So what you do, you charge people more at the pump for gas, and that reduces the amount of gasoline that people purchase. But then you give them back a share of what was collected so that their income is not decreased. And you can do this in such a way that the people who need to drive most to get to work get back a larger share of what they pay.
That sell you're making, Professor Romer, is similar to the argument that's advanced for a number of democratic socialist positions like single-payer health care. You'll pay more taxes up front, there's the argument, which I happen to subscribe to, but you'll pay less over time because you're not going to have these high insurance bills. Jobs won't be lost because companies don't have to pay these high insurance bills. That's a tough political sell because people who oppose it, let's say insurance companies that don't want to say single-payer, they will fund conservative politicians who warn you, you use your health care, you pay these high taxes, and that it becomes a more difficult argument to make politically that you save more overall because what you're not going to pay on the other end.
Well, I mean, you do save a huge amount overall. This country spends more than twice as much
on
as a percentage of its
good
income on.
I'm just saying that how can you make that two-part argument
But I think
to
there's
people?
something you miss, which is I think the main argument that Obama should have made when he was pushing for the ACA was the intergenerational argument. The point is, when you're young, on average, you're going to pay into the system through your taxes because you'll use less health care than the average person when you're young and healthy. When you're old, you take it out of the system.
Like Social Security.
You use much more health care, but you still pay the same thing in, right? So over your lifetime, it evens out. Over your lifetime, it evens out. And that's the main argument. Now, there's also a redistribution. If it's funded through income taxes, there's a redistribution from the rich to the poor because the rich will be paying much more in taxes that are allocated to the health service than ordinary people or poor people. So it's both redistributive, and which is why the wealthy generally don't like it, why the Republican Party doesn't like it, because the Republican Party, after all is said and done, represents the top 1% of the income distribution in this country. So it's a redistribution from rich to poor, and it will show when it eventually happens in this country that the state can organize an excellent system for providing this very important service to people. That's been the case in other countries. I mean, if you look at the British, despite all the problems they have with their national health service, they're hugely proud of it.
Now, in terms of foreign policy, before I let you go, thank you again for joining us today, John Romer. Is there a foreign policy of the new socialism? For instance, the party of socialism, not democratic socialism, the party of socialism in this city, New Haven, demonstrated at City Hall on behalf of Maduro, the leader of Venezuela, and Chavez. Is that a socialist position? Because they call themselves socialists.
No, I think that's a terrible mistake. I think Maduro is just as bad as any African potentate who steals money from the people. Just terrible. So I don't think Maduro represents any kind of socialism. I think Chavez had ideas that some of them sounded much better than Maduro, but I mean the quality of his assessment of people is demonstrated in his choice of Maduro to be his successor, which was an absolutely terrible.
And you also talked about democracy. They're authoritarian. It was a authoritarian government.
Very anti-democratic. I mean, they've tried to replace all the normal democratic municipal government with their own so-called Bolivarian councils and so on. I mean, it's just a travesty what's happened in Venezuela.
John Romer, have you had a moment? Has this interest in socialism led to more sales of your book, And have you been
No, the book was
speaking
written.
more?
You're a bit behind the times, Paul. The book was published in 1994.
I feel like we're still in 1994.
Well, anyway, books that are published in 1994 don't usually continue selling for 25 years after they were published.
But is there a renewed interest in your scholarship?
I think
because of this
there is.
moment?
You invited me to come on the show.
That's right. You've now hit the pinnacle, the media pinnacle. And people will be talking about the show will be embedded in an article in the New Haven Independent. I'm sure over the next week you'll be getting some feedback.
Okay, thank
I
you.
learned a lot just talking to you for a half hour. I think your students at Yale are very lucky that they get to learn with you, John Romer. And am I pronouncing your last name right?
You are.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us today and filling us in on the new socialism.
Thank you.
Some of us from old central committees do believe that 1994 is the modern age. I mean, the youth wing of the Communist Party, I think, starts at 70, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thanks for the comment, Eric. And we're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience performing I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free from the group CD, A Plea for Peace. This is Paul Bass inviting you to fly free with us all day and all night at WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio.